Every morning at 7:15 a.m., he drove the same route, spoke the same quiet words to the kids, and never once mentioned the day he saved 47 soldiers in Vietnam. Until a young teacher noticed something that changed everything. Welcome to Story with Jorge. Before we begin this incredible story of hidden heroism and silent sacrifice, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. The yellow school bus pulled up to Riverside Elementary at exactly 7:43 a.m., same as it had every weekday for the past 20 years. Behind the wheel sat Tom Richardson, a man whose gentle voice had become as familiar to 3 generations of children as the sound of the morning bell. "Morning, Emma. Got your backpack?" he'd say to the freckled 3rd grader who always forgot something. "Ready for that math test, Marcus?" to the nervous 4th grader clutching his calculator. "Drive safe, Mr. Tom," the kids would chorus as they filed off, and he'd nod with that same quiet smile, waiting until every child was safely inside before pulling away. Tom Richardson was 68 years old, stood about 5'9" with silver hair that had been perfectly combed the same way since 1975. He wore the same navy blue uniform shirt every day, pressed but never new, and spoke with the kind of soft authority that made even the rowdiest kids settle down without being asked. To everyone at Riverside Elementary, Tom was simply the bus driver. Reliable, kind, forgettable in the best possible way. The kind of man who did his job with quiet dignity and went home to a small house where nobody waited up for him. What they didn't know was that Tom Richardson had once been Staff Sergeant Thomas Richardson, 1st Cavalry Division, and that the small American flag pin on his collar wasn't just patriotic decoration. It was the only outward sign of a day in 1969 when he'd earned the nation's highest military honor. Sarah Martinez had been teaching 4th grade for exactly 3 months when she first really noticed Tom. She was 26, fresh out of her master's program, full of energy and the kind of curiosity that made her a good teacher, and sometimes got her into trouble. She'd been having a rough morning. Copied lesson plans had jammed the printer, half her class had forgotten their permission slips, and the coffee in the teacher's lounge tasted like it had been brewing since the Reagan administration. As she hurried out to bus duty, she nearly collided with Tom, who was checking his mirrors before the afternoon departure. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Tom," she said, steadying herself against the bus door. "No harm done, Miss Martinez," he replied in that calm voice of his. "Rough day?" She laughed, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Is it that obvious?" 20 years of watching teachers tells me everything I need to know," he said with a gentle smile. "It gets easier." As Sarah stepped back, her eyes caught something she'd never noticed before. There, tucked between Tom's sun visor and the windshield, was a small, faded photograph. Black and white, creased with age. It showed a group of young soldiers, maybe 8 or 9 of them, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning despite the jungle backdrop and mud-stained uniforms. One of them looked remarkably like a young Tom Richardson. "Is that—" she began, but Tom had already pulled the visor down, blocking her view. "Better get those kids loaded up," he said quietly. "Traffic's getting heavy." That night, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. Something about the way Tom had moved to hide it, the careful way he'd changed the subject. She found herself wondering about the man who drove her students to school every day, and realizing she knew almost nothing about him. Sarah Martinez wasn't the type to let mysteries go unsolved. It was what made her a good teacher, that persistent curiosity, the need to understand the whole story. So the next morning, she arrived at school 30 minutes early and walked out to the bus lot. Tom was already there, as he always was, doing his pre-trip inspection. He looked up as she approached, and for just a moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not annoyance exactly, more like the look of someone who'd been expecting this conversation for a long time. "Morning, Miss Martinez. You're here early." "I couldn't sleep," she said honestly. Mr. Tom, can I ask you something? He set down his clipboard and leaned against the bus, waiting. That photograph yesterday? Were you in the military? Tom was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the morning was still and cool, the school empty except for a few early arriving faculty members. Finally, he nodded once. Long time ago? Vietnam? Another nod. Sarah felt like she was approaching something fragile, something that might break if she pushed too hard. My grandfather was there too. He never talked about it much. Tom's expression softened slightly. Most of us don't. Can I see the picture again? Tom hesitated, then reached up and pulled the photograph from behind the visor. He handed it to her carefully, like it was made of spun glass. Sarah studied the faces, young men, barely older than her students, trying to smile for the camera despite everything. She found Tom's face easily. Even 50 years later, his eyes were unmistakable. You all look so young, she said softly. We were. I was 19 when that was taken. Are they? She couldn't finish the question. Some. His voice was barely above a whisper. Not all. Sarah handed the photograph back, and as Tom tucked it carefully behind the visor again, she noticed something else. His hands, which were always steady on the steering wheel, shook slightly. Mr. Tom, she said gently, thank you for your service. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not pain exactly, but a deep, quiet weight. I was just doing my job, he said finally. Same as now. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, a cup of tea growing cold beside her. She'd been researching for 2 hours, following threads through military databases and historical records, most of them leading nowhere. She'd started with what she knew. Tom Richardson, Vietnam War, 1st Cavalry Division. The basic service records were there but sanitized, routine. Nothing that explained the weight she'd seen in his eyes or why he'd kept that photograph for 50 years. She was about to give up when she found it. It was buried in a digitized archive of old newspaper articles, a small piece from the Atlanta Constitution dated October 15, 1969. The headline read, Local Soldier Honored for Heroism in Vietnam Action. The article was brief. Staff Sergeant Thomas Richardson, 20, of Riverside, Georgia, has been awarded the Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against enemy forces near An Loc, South Vietnam, on September 14, 1969. According to military sources, Sergeant Richardson single-handedly held off enemy forces for over 4 hours while coordinating the evacuation of 47 wounded soldiers from an overrun fire base. Despite being wounded twice, Richardson maintained his position until the last evacuee was airlifted to safety. Richardson could not be reached for comment. Sarah stared at the screen, her tea forgotten, her heart pounding. The Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States, and Tom Richardson, quiet, gentle Tom who helped kids with their backpacks and remembered everyone's name, had never mentioned it once. She scrolled down and found another article, this one from a week later. Medal of Honor recipient Thomas Richardson returned to Riverside yesterday but declined requests for interviews. He just wants to come home and be left alone, said his mother, Mrs. Dorothy Richardson. He's done enough. The last line hit Sarah like a punch to the chest. He'd been 20 years old, 20, younger than she was now, and he'd saved 47 lives. Sarah couldn't concentrate on her lesson plans. She couldn't focus on grading papers. All she could think about was Tom Richardson and how many mornings she'd watched him help children onto his bus, never knowing that those same hands had once pulled wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. The next morning she was waiting by his bus when he arrived. Miss Martinez. He didn't seem surprised to see her. You have the Medal of Honor. It wasn't a question. Tom looked at her for a long moment, then unlocked his bus door and climbed inside. For a moment, Sarah thought he was going to drive away without another word. Instead, he gestured for her to get on. She climbed the steps and took the seat directly behind him. The bus smelled like worn vinyl and that industrial disinfectant the school used, familiar and somehow comforting. "You looked it up," Tom said quietly. "I'm a teacher. It's what I do." He was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wasn't going to respond. Finally, he spoke. 47 men. The article said you saved them all." "I didn't save anybody." His voice was firm but not harsh. "I just did what needed doing, same as every other man there." "But you stayed. When everyone else was evacuated, you stayed." Tom turned in his seat to look at her directly. Those men had families waiting for them. Wives, children, parents. Someone had to make sure they got home. "What about your family? What about the people waiting for you?" Something shifted in Tom's expression, a crack in that careful composure he'd maintained for decades. There wasn't anybody waiting. The weight of that admission settled between them. Sarah understood now why Tom had never married, why he lived alone in his small house, why he'd dedicated his life to taking care of other people's children. "There was," she said softly. "There were 47 families who were waiting for their sons and husbands and fathers to come home. Because of you, they did." Tom's hands gripped the steering wheel, and for a moment Sarah saw the 19-year-old soldier he'd once been, scared, determined, carrying a weight too heavy for anyone that young. "I lost friends that day," he said finally. "Good men, better men than me. But you made sure 47 others didn't lose theirs." Word spread quietly through Riverside Elementary, the way news does in small places where everyone knows everyone. Not gossip exactly, but a kind of reverent whisper. "Did you know? About Mr. Tom, the Medal of Honor?" Sarah hadn't meant for it to get out. She'd told exactly one person, her principal, Mrs. Chen, because she felt like someone in authority should know. Mrs. Chen had told her husband, who was a veteran himself. He'd told a few people at the VFW. And so it went. Within a week, Tom Richardson found his quiet life turned upside down. It started small. A few parents lingered a little longer at pickup, shaking his hand, saying thank you. A couple of teachers brought him coffee, which he accepted politely but with obvious discomfort. Then the local newspaper called. Then the TV station. The mayor's office wanted to organize a ceremony. The VFW wanted to honor him at their annual dinner. Tom declined everything. "I don't understand," Sarah said. She'd found him in the bus lot after school, sitting alone in his driver's seat, staring out at the empty playground. "This is an honor. People want to celebrate what you did." "I don't want to be celebrated," Tom said quietly. "I just want to do my job." "But Mr. Tom, you're a hero." He turned to look at her, and she saw something she'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but a deep, bone-deep weariness. "I'm not a hero, Miss Martinez. Heroes are the men who didn't come home. I'm just the one who got lucky enough to keep living." But if Tom thought he could return to anonymity, he'd underestimated the power of elementary school children and their absolute inability to keep secrets. Emma, the third grader who always forgot her backpack, climbed onto the bus the next morning with her eyes wide with wonder. "Mr. Tom, my daddy says you're famous. He says you saved a whole bunch of soldiers." "Is that true, Mr. Tom?" asked Marcus, the nervous fourth grader. "Are you like a real hero?" More voices chimed in. "My mom says you have a special medal." "Did you really fight in a war? Were you scared?" Tom sat quietly as the questions washed over him, his hands steady on the steering wheel. Sarah, who was riding along that morning as part of a routine safety check, watched him carefully. She expected him to deflect, to change the subject the way he always did. Instead, he did something that surprised her. He pulled the bus over to the side of the road, put it in park, and turned to face his passengers. "Yes," he said simply. "I was a soldier, a long time ago." The bus fell silent except for the gentle rumble of the engine. "Was it scary?" asked Emma in a small voice. Tom considered this. "Yes, it was very scary. But you did it anyway." "Sometimes," Tom said carefully, "being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you do what's right even when you are afraid." Marcus raised his hand like he was in class. "Mr. Tom, why don't you like talking about it?" Tom was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than Sarah had ever heard it. "When something sad happens, sometimes it's hard to talk about, even when good things happen too. Does that make sense?" Several of the children nodded. They understood sadness, even if they couldn't understand war. "But Mr. Tom," said a voice from the back of the bus, Jenny, a quiet fifth grader who rarely spoke up. "My grandma says that sometimes talking about sad things makes them hurt less." Tom met Jenny's eyes in the rearview mirror. After a moment he smiled, a real smile, not the polite one he usually wore. "Your grandma sounds very wise, Jenny." What happened next would be talked about at Riverside Elementary for years to come. Tom Richardson, who had never spoken about Vietnam beyond the bare minimum, began to tell his story. Not the dramatic parts. He didn't talk about the firefight or the medals or the headlines. He told them about the small things, about how he'd joined the army because he wanted to serve his country and how scared he'd been on the plane to Vietnam. About his friend Danny Martinez. "That's like Miss Martinez," the kids had chorused, who used to share his care packages from home, about how they'd play cards in their bunkers and talk about what they wanted to do when they got home, about how some of them did come home and some of them didn't, and how the ones who came home promised to remember the ones who stayed. He told them that being a soldier meant taking care of the people next to you, and that sometimes the best way to honor the people you'd lost was to take care of the people you could still help. "Like us?" asked Emma. "Like you," Tom agreed. Sarah found herself crying quietly in the front seat, not from sadness, but from something deeper, a recognition of the profound gentleness it took for a man carrying such weight to dedicate his life to children, to safety, to the simple daily act of making sure everyone got home. That afternoon, as the last child got off the bus, Tom turned to Sarah. "You started something," he said, but he didn't sound angry. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to get out." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe it was time." "How do you feel about it?" Tom considered this. "Lighter, maybe. Like I've been holding my breath for 50 years and just remembered how to exhale." Sarah smiled. "The kids love you even more now, you know. They loved me before. Kids don't care about medals. They care about whether you show up. And you always show up. It's what I do." As Sarah got off the bus, Tom called after her. "Miss Martinez." She turned. "Thank you for caring enough to ask." Tom Richardson continued driving bus number 47, a coincidence that nobody mentioned but everybody noticed, for 3 more years before he retired. The school board offered him a ceremony, a plaque, a formal recognition of his service both in Vietnam and to the school district. He accepted a small reception in the school library, attended by current students, former students who were now adults, their parents, and a handful of fellow veterans who came to pay their respects. The only speech given was by Emma, now a 6th grader, who stood up and said simply, "Mr. Tom taught us that being brave means doing the right thing even when you're scared, and that the best way to honor people is to take care of each other. Thank you for taking care of us." Tom Richardson, recipient of the Medal of Honor, veteran of Vietnam, quiet guardian of 3 generations of school children, wiped his eyes and said, "Thank you for letting me." After he retired, Tom moved to a small apartment closer to the VA hospital where he volunteered, reading to patients and helping with physical therapy. The photograph of his unit, which had hidden behind his bus visor for 20 years, now sat on his kitchen table where he could see it every morning. Sometimes former students would visit. Emma, now in high school and thinking about joining the military herself, Marcus, who'd become a teacher, Jenny, whose grandmother's wisdom about talking through sadness had changed more than she'd ever know. They'd sit in his small living room, and he'd tell them stories, not about war, but about friendship, about courage, about the quiet heroism of showing up every day and doing what needs to be done. And sometimes, when they asked about that day in 1969 when he saved 47 lives, he'd shake his head and say what he'd always said, "I didn't save anybody. I just made sure they got home." But Sarah Martinez, now a principal herself, kept a copy of that old newspaper article in her desk drawer, and sometimes she'd take it out and read the last line again. "He just wants to come home and be left alone. He's done enough." She'd think about Tom Richardson, who'd never stopped serving, never stopped caring, never stopped making sure that everybody, wounded soldiers, scared children, anyone who needed it, got home safe. And she'd think that maybe, just maybe, some people never stop being heroes. They just get quieter about it. The Medal of Honor citation, which Tom had never framed, never displayed, never mentioned, sat in a simple wooden box in his bedroom closet. But its words, conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, lived every day in the gentle way he'd helped children onto his bus, remembered their names, made sure they felt safe. Some heroes wear their medals on their chest, others carry them in their heart and share them through decades of quiet service, one morning route at a time. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, a curious teacher will notice an old photograph and ask the right questions, and a whole community will learn that heroes have been driving their children to school all along. Have you ever met someone like Tom Richardson? Someone whose quiet service hid an extraordinary story? Share their name in the comments below. Here at Story with Jorge, we believe that the most powerful heroes are often the ones who never ask for recognition. They just show up day after day, making sure everyone gets home safe. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel and help us honor the quiet heroes who walk among us. Their stories deserve to be told.